You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Corn is a tropical grass. Basically, over centuries of native seed selection, native farmers were able to adapt corn into a wide variety of cultivars that suited the particular climatic conditions for wherever they were planting it. The Wampanoags in particular were faced with this problem of developing corn and maintaining actual varieties of corn after they were developed with the priority of earliness. So it seems like most of these Wampanoag crops by the 17th century, these corn crops could produce between 60 and 80 days, popping them well underneath that 100-day frost-free growing season barrier. And the actual literal way that Wampanoag seed savers would do this is they would select ears from the bottom of the corn stalk nearest the ground, which have been pollinated by other plants that had flowered the fastest.
Hello, and welcome to episode 426 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. With Thanksgiving next week, many Americans will gather to reflect on gratitude, family, and of course, food. This is the time of year when we may think about that so-called first Thanksgiving and imagine scenes of Pilgrims and Native peoples gathering to share in the bounty of their fall harvests. But how much do we know about the food systems and agricultural knowledge of the indigenous people in North America? And in what ways were the Wampanoag people actually able to contribute to this first Thanksgiving? Michael Wise, an associate professor of history at the University of North Texas, and the author of Native Foods, Agriculture, Indigeneity, and Settler Colonialism in American History, leads us on an exploration that will challenge 4 myths we have about indigenous food practices and help us uncover how Native communities shaped and stewarded the land and its agriculture long before European colonists ever arrived. During our exploration, Michael reveals how indigenous agricultural systems, like those of the Wampanoag and Cherokee, sustained communities for generations, why early American landscapes looked and functioned very differently than we've been taught, and how myths about Native people being hunters rather than farmers serve to justify white dispossession and erasure of indigenous peoples from native lands and our histories. Our conversation is a powerful reminder that indigenous peoples didn't just survive in the early American period. They innovated, cultivated, and thrived as they nourished their land and their communities. It's also a good reminder that indigenous people, like the Wampanoag and Cherokee, are still here, and they continue to do a lot to contribute to our shared history and our shared foodways. Now, before we dive into our conversation with Michael, I'd like to wish you and your loved ones a very happy Thanksgiving. Please know that I am grateful that you are a part of our Ben Franklin's World community. Thank you so much for listening and considering our guests' ideas, and thank you for your support of this work. Happy Thanksgiving. Okay. Are you ready to rethink Native foodways and the landscapes of early America? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is an associate professor of history at the University of North Texas. His research expertise is in environmental history, food and agricultural history, animal-human relationships, and the history of the American West. He's the author of 2 books, Producing Predators, Wolves' Work and Conquest in the Northern Rockies, and his second book, Native Foods, Agriculture, Indigeneity, and Settler Colonialism in American History. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Michael Wise.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, in Native Foods, Michael sets out to reframe the way that we look at indigenous agriculture and foodways, so that we can see the indigenous landscapes of North America and dispel 4 myths that have informed how we view indigenous agriculture. Michael, would you tell us how we've been trained to see the landscape of North America and about these 4 myths that inform how we see that landscape?
Yeah, the landscape, as far as historians often approach the term, is seen as a static place, or at least something that is biophysical, sort of like the stage on which human actors go about their lives and make their decisions. And really the sort of central insight that my book is trying to bring to bear in terms of native and colonial food histories is the fact that our agricultural landscape isn't just a sort of static stage, but as cultural geographers might put it, more of like a stage curtain. So the landscape itself is a curtain that's obscuring many of the stories and the histories. Not only are they ignored often, but in fact, they're intentionally ignored and subconsciously ignored by historians who don't always take critically the sort of inherited landscapes, the ways of seeing place and ways of seeing the world that most of us, in the United States and throughout the settler colonial world have grown up sort of being educated, whether intentionally or otherwise. The farm in particular has long been one of these landscapes that I'm very interested in. My mom and dad both grew up on farms. I'm an agricultural historian, and the farm in the United States in particular is sort of like this primal scene of American history. And early American historians often, we always encounter this with Thomas Jefferson's sort of yeoman agrarian republic, where the farm becomes this basic social unit of American history. And what we then think of when we think of a farm becomes specifically tied to what are 9 times out of 10 these culturally white settler colonial practices, different relations of gendered labor, different sets of crops, different sets of ecological and biophysical communities. And really what I wanted to do with this book is reconsider some of those base level assumptions, I think, that represent the lowest common denominator of historical discourse whenever early American historians in particular are writing about the environment of early America, of the colonies. So these 4 myths that I wanted to use as my starting point for picking apart this more complicated cultural history of agricultural landscapes. First of all, the myth that Native people in the United States never really had agriculture. This is the foundational myth. The second myth that because Native people didn't have agriculture, that they were basically hunters. The third myth that Native people, because they relied only on the chase, as Thomas Jefferson might put it, were always hungry. And then the fourth myth that because Native people were always hungry, they never really developed any taste or any kind of higher order cuisine, as did the gastronomes of contemporaneous Europe. So this book addresses all 4 of those myths in relation to how those 4 myths have become foundational historical understandings for the ongoing presence of settler colonialism, not just in the United States, but particularly in the historical narratives that historians in the United States continue to tell. I mentioned in the book, too, that even though I'm calling them myths, they're not even so much that. They're something bigger. They are something that represents an entire discursive practice on which historians and other folks in the humanities and social sciences are immersed. So this is sort of my attempt to offer an interdisciplinary or perhaps multidisciplinary look at early American history that, among other things, is trying to take seriously the fact that the way many of us have been subconsciously educated to see agricultural landscapes obscures as much as it reveals, as Stoss is saying.
One of the ideas that really surprised me when I read Native Foods was how we have this idea of what early American landscapes are supposed to look like. For example, I grew up and I live in the Northeast. So I always have a picture of an early New England farm in my head. We have the farmhouse, we have the kids, we have the animals running around the farm. And that farm occupies open, cleared farm space. And it looks just like a permanent place, a place that people are going to live in for generations. But when you think about indigenous or native landscapes, you realize that indigenous people in the early American period, they had much larger landscapes to make use of. Their homes were miles and miles big. So they have spaces to farm in these homes, they have spaces to hunt. And while their land doesn't look as cleared or permanent as these European New England farm landscapes look like, indigenous agricultural spaces often did require a lot of moving around. These were permanent spaces, but they were also mobile spaces where indigenous people went from season to season to take advantage of farming or hunting or gathering or whatever their food requirements required. So these are still permanent landscapes, but they're also dynamic and fertile landscapes for growing and hunting food.
Absolutely right. And I think that way of seeing the agricultural landscape is a particular way that is privileging private property ownership and the sort of vision of a 160-acre family farm that is the domain of an able-bodied, heteronormative male property owner with a household of gendered and different aged labor, creating a sort of subsistence for the family and also a market surplus for sale. This is sort of the American fantasy. And one that it took me a while to get to this point, but one that I realized suffuses historical narratives in the United States and beyond, this sort of Euro-American context, which is descended, of course, from the sort of overall agrarian desires of English and other European immigrants to the colonies. I think the point here is that this is a fantasy, this idea, and most farms never really looked this way, even European ones. This particular idea of private property and private family farm, this is an element that I don't really think emerged even in English history until closer to the 16th century. So it's something that emerges in England around about the same time it's reaching its fuller articulation in parts of New England.
Now, before we look more closely at the agricultural practices of 2 or 3 of the different indigenous peoples and nations that Michael studied in native foods, we should really talk about the role of gender and the formation of these 4 myths. Michael, Beth would like to know about the roles Indigenous and European women and men played in the kitchen and in the different food growing spaces of the early American period.
Great question. I think in reality, women and men played a lot of the same actual roles in the kitchen. However, how those spaces on the farm and in the kitchen were gendered in terms of the expectations of labor and whose place belonged to whom, that differed dramatically. I think the most striking difference probably just simply boils down to the legal status in which women found themselves in the American colonies under the English common law of coverture, whereby their identities were subsumed by whomever their male patriarch might have been, a husband or a father. Another substantial difference in terms of labor in the kitchen, movement around the fields and in and out of the household, I think had to do with polygonal relations that many Native communities and matriarchal polygynous relationships that differ dramatically from English expectations of a monogamous marriage shaping a household. One of the considerations that I make in the book, particularly in the context of New England, is the fact that colonists seemed horrified, or at least feigned horror at this idea of Native polygamy. And yet the plight of Euro-American women in the colonies, in New England in particular, was one where each woman on average gave birth 7 times during their lifetime. Many perished young, maybe after 1 or 2 births. Basically, what ends up happening, if you pay close attention to family histories in colonial New England, I mean, men are basically running through wives at a sequential rate. For many of them, 2, 3, or more wives over the course of their lifetime in the history of their own household. So my question is sort of that serial monogamy differ from Wampanoag and other Native community practices of polygamy. That's one kind of major difference, I think, is just in terms of how Native people and colonial people understood what might constitute a proper cooperative relationship within a household between a man and a woman. But I think the realities on the ground were much more complicated, and there was far more variation in terms of the actual division of labor. And one of the sort of deep insecurities that afflicted colonial society, too, was the extent to which Native women demonstrated to colonial women and colonial men, too, the capacities of women to be agriculturalists, to farm, to butcher animals. These were tasks that colonial women were also doing. They were just tasks that colonial men thought were tasks that should be provided by the male head of household, more or less, and tasks that represented male propriety over agricultural spaces and male propriety over economic production. So as all gender performances go, I think often we take the performances or we grant them more power than probably they actually had in terms of the agricultural practices and household practices. I think another interesting difference to consider has to do with the colonial practice of dairying. So women's household production of cheese in particular, this was a foundational source of cash in New England for much of the 17th century. And this was money generated not through cash crops. Colonial farmers weren't really growing any cash crops. The only real cash crop on these farms was cheese and milk, butter. So this was wholly within the realm of women's work, so to speak, the ticklish business of dairying, as folks would put it. So if Beth is interested in digging some more into the sort of maybe unexpected ambiguities between men's and women's labor in the colonial world, maybe dairying is an interesting place to look.
In his book, Native Foods, Michael traces the history and foodways of 4 different Native nations to show the development of the 4 myths that he mentioned about Native agriculture, as well as the realities of Native food production. Michael, the first people you investigate in Native foods are the Wampanoag, who live in what is now southern Massachusetts, what we call the Cape and Islands region of Massachusetts, which happens to include Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. Would you tell us what Wampanoag agriculture looked like by the turn of the 17th century in this eastern part of the Dawnlands, which is how the Wampanoag and other indigenous peoples of New England refer to Massachusetts and New England?
Yeah, Wampanoag agriculture was highly developed, which would come as no surprise. But I think maybe what's often more surprising to folks who aren't necessarily students of this moment, too, is how Wampanoag agriculture produced a surplus that also enlivened a pretty massive trade between what's now southern New England and parts of northern New England, where agriculture was less developed solely due to the fact that there was a shorter growing season. Once you get north of sort of the present-day boundaries of the state of Massachusetts into southern Vermont and New Hampshire, the number of frost-free growing days dramatically drops. So Wabanaki and other northern communities would trade for these Wampanoag agricultural surpluses, exchanging caribou and other kinds of northern foodstuffs for corn and beans and squash, which thrived along the coast and farther south in the river valleys of New England, the Connecticut River Valley in particular.
Would you tell us more about the Wampanoag and their establishment of corn as a staple of their diet? Because as you mentioned, you need at least 100 frost-free days to grow corn, and yet this is the period of the Little Ice Age in the 17th and 18th centuries. So how did the Wampanoag manage to cultivate corn and make it a staple of their diet, knowing that this growing season of New England is actually very short in this period?
This is such an epic story, the entire diffusion of corn from its sort of earliest domestication, probably thousands of years ago from Teosinte in what's now Central America. And then it spread into North America, as far north as we know as New England, where Wampanoags had been growing corn for at least 6 or 7 centuries before the Plymouth colonists arrived to start digging it up and replanting it. Corn is a tropical grass. Basically, over centuries of native seed selection, native farmers were able to adapt corn into a wide variety of cultivars that suited the particular climatic conditions for wherever they were planting it. The Wampanoags in particular were faced with this problem of developing corn and maintaining actual varieties of corn after they were developed with the priority of earliness, which is what agronomists in the modern period just refer to as like how soon you can get a crop to eat after planting. So it seems like most of these Wampanoag crops by the 17th century, these corn crops could produce between 60 and 80 days, popping them well underneath that 100-day frost-free growing season barrier. And the actual literal way that Wampanoag seed savers would do this is they would select ears from the bottom of the corn stalk nearest the ground, which have been pollinated by other plants that had flowered the fastest. There are other ways of inducing earliness, as you may know if you're into corn, that crop engineers have used through hybridizations and then later on through genetic engineering. But yeah, the simplest way to select for earlier corn is simply to select corn that have been pollinated by the plants that have flowered first. The way that corn pollinates, it pollinates by wind. So these enormous clouds of corn pollen washed all over the place when the corn is flowering. And all of those little tiny corn silks on an ear of corn, each one of those silks gets pollinated and then turns into a kernel, the seed. So if you've ever gone to the store and you've bought some corn on the cob and brought it home disappointed to see that half of the kernels were shriveled up, that's basically a problem with pollination. So that's one of the reasons why corn too needs to be planted in big blocks. If you plant corn just like a handful of plants in your backyard, you're probably not going to get sufficient pollination because you just need a sort of larger mass of corn planted at once. It's a grass, so I guess it likes to have friends growing alongside it. That profligacy of corn, though, the fact that it pollinates by wind, also means that it's very difficult to isolate different varieties of corn. So if you have a well-developed agriculture based on corn, one of your challenges is to separate the different varieties of corn that you're growing. So one of the ways that Wampanoag farmers did this was they would grow out different varieties of corn through selecting seeds based on color as well. Because color is one of the most reliable indicators of a particular parentage for corn. It just so happens that it's easy to select corn based on color. So this allowed Wampanoag farmers basically to stagger their plantings. So you'd have 60-day corns, you'd have 80-day corns, you'd figure out which ones were earliest, you get them all color-coded. I mean, this is work that took place over generations of seed selection. And then you could plant your corn by color in successive patterns every couple of weeks in order to ensure that one color corn, let's say your red corn, was done pollinating by the time your yellow corn would be pollinating in order to keep them separate. And then if there was any cross-pollination, it'd be easy to tell because the corn would be the wrong color. One of the earliest accounts of the Mayflower out on the Cape, digging up some corn caches, some native corn caches. Everyone's remarking about the marvelous different colors of corn. And one of the curious things, I guess, for me when I was working on this book was rereading some of those passages with this sort of knowledge of Wampanoag agricultural history too, and just thinking about all of the things that went unseen in those moments when colonists were introduced to native food without any kind of context for the enormous amount of work and thought and organization went into its production.
This is really a remarkable story because if you think about the way we learn early American history, it's always the Europeans who brought the science of food and agriculture to North America, and it was on their arrival that Europeans supposedly taught indigenous peoples how to cultivate superior crops. But when we look at this Wampanoag history with corn, we can clearly see that indigenous people had been applying this food science for generations before Europeans arrived, and they were quite successful in figuring out how to grow this tropical grass, corn, in a region where corn really had no business in growing.
Yeah, and corn has so many advantages over the old world crops that colonists tried to grow, not only in New England, but elsewhere in North America. First and foremost of these advantages is because corn is a tropical grass, it thrives in warm and hot and humid environments. It's actually a grass that has a different biochemical process for photosynthesis than old world European grain crops like wheat and oats and barley. Basically, that process is called C4 photosynthesis versus C3, where because the photosynthetic process has 4 carbon molecules basically that get released, the plant more efficiently converts carbon dioxide into sugars without having to release as much oxygen when the plant's growing. So on a really hot, humid summer day, while the wheat and the barley and the oats are wilting, corn, it likes those conditions. It seems to do just fine. So there are other advantages too. I think just the mechanical advantage of a corn kernel versus the small seed, wheat obviously, but also rye and barley and oats. On the compact soils that hadn't been plowed, it's much easier to germinate corn. Corn will basically germinate anywhere. As anyone knows who's just taken a handful of it and chucked it out or tried to plant it or had squirrels spread it around or something like that. Corn will germinate on the forest floor, even in shade. It's probably not going to do too well or produce a crop in shade, but it'll germinate anywhere. So contrast that with the sort of mechanical disadvantage of these small grained old world crops where the soil had to be worked at least a little bit in order to get the crop to germinate, in order to get the seed to actually germinate. So I think these are the kinds of technical aspects of agricultural production, too, that when they're ignored by historians, it makes it a lot easier to just sort of roll along with this idea, Liz, that I think you articulated very well, that Europeans are the bringers of agricultural knowledge and science and things like that. I mean, I encourage all of my students and my colleagues, whenever they're writing about agriculture, about food, to try to grow some of it themselves or take seriously the sort of technical aspects of its production. As an aside, I'm teaching this class at the University of North Texas, and it's called Horticultural Histories. And we're even working in class to extract DNA out of plants. It's like not just enough that I want my students to know that genetic engineering has this history. You know, how many people in a history class actually ever learn how genetically modified organisms are produced in a lab? So I think paying some extra attention to these sort of technical processes of agricultural production and horticulture can really yield some big insights for historians.
Could you tell us about the creativity the Wampanoag people have with their corn, beans, and squash, which they typically grow together, and about the different dishes they cook with these different foods?
One of the famous Wampanoag dishes is succotash, which is a dish that was widely adopted by colonists as well. Basically just a corn, squash, and bean soup stew. So many other corn-based dishes were consumed throughout the Wampanoag culinary world, basically. Green corn, of course, the corn before it's dried. Dried corn itself would be used for all kinds of different purposes, whether cooked in like a stew or ground into a flour. Ground corn would be baked into sort of like a tortilla and then used as a portable food. There are also what we think of in the 21st century is the Mexican tamal. In Spanish, you call it tamal. This is like a widespread dish that's existed in the Americas for probably thousands of years, where different native communities would produce a kind of corn bread that would be steamed inside some kind of a container, whether that would be like a corn stalk or a banana leaf or, whatever might be at hand. Native communities, the Cherokee are probably most known for using beans to make a kind of bean bread that's steamed like a tamal. And this was a practice common across North America. I think one of the reasons why native cuisine is sort of hidden in plain sight, simply because so many of these native dishes aren't really considered to be native dishes. They're considered to be American dishes, or they're considered to be Mexican dishes or Central American dishes or Caribbean dishes, when there's sort of like these diasporic native foods.
Before we start talking about Cherokee agriculture, something that struck me as I read your book, Native Foods, was your discussion of Indigenous people in New England. Now, speaking from my experience, New England isn't traditionally a place where we're taught to recognize that there were and are Indigenous people like the Wampanoag who survive and live in this region today. And when we're taught to think about Indigenous land dispossession, it's always in this later period with the Indian Removal Act in the 1830s, and in a landscape that's really far removed from New England, because we're taught to think of the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears and their forced removal to Oklahoma. So what struck me about your book, Native Foods, is how it prompts us to think about not just earlier periods of Indigenous dispossession, like the dispossession that occurred in New England during the 17th and 18th centuries, but also how that dispossession wasn't just about the physical removal of Indigenous peoples from lands that white Europeans and Americans coveted. It was really also a dispossession of Indigenous people from the agriculture of their lands, from their agriculture of their lands.
Yeah, I think a lot of us in the last 40 years in early American history and Native and Indigenous studies have looked at New England as kind of a classic example of the erase and replace mentality of settler colonialism, in particular, how historians in the colonial era also discursively spoke and wrote out Native people out of existence in New England, when obviously Native communities persisted in New England, thrived in New England, carried on, etc. One place, though, where we as historians haven't spent enough time critically dismantling those myths is thinking about how this process of dispossession worked really through these landscape transformations, through these transformations from native fields literally into colonial fields. I mean, I think the Plymouth colony is perhaps the first obvious example of this, where the colony was founded basically on this town, Patuxet, that was in all likelihood not simply depopulated by disease, which I think is another element of this myth here, that by the time Pilgrims arrived, Wampanoags were all decimated by smallpox or some other disease. But if you have knowledge of Wampanoag agricultural practices, Wampanoags often would just leave fields fallow for a period of time, maybe 10 or 15 years, for natural soil replenishment before returning to that field. So it's not like this site had been abandoned. It was just in a state of fallowing, would be another way to see this. But all up and down the river valleys of New England, in particular, the Connecticut Valley, town after town after town in the 17th century was built literally on top of native villages, and farm after farm built literally on top of native fields. Fields that had been cleared by native people using fire, and had been utilized for generations to grow corn, beans, squash, and a variety of other annual crops. I'd also like to point out, too, I mean, the other way that this transformation worked out wasn't even so much in the fields, but in the forests as well. The forest to New Englanders was evil wilderness, the den of Satan, a sort of untrammeled landscape. But for native people, the forest was an actively managed landscape. Basically, the Wampanoags practiced agroforestry. They selectively burned the forest floor and cut down trees in strategic places in order to increase the penetration of sunlight to particular openings in the forest, with the goal of producing a forest in which deer and other game animals thrived on a steady supply of nuts and acorns from mast-bearing trees, and where these openings between forest and meadow allowed sun to grow different kinds of perennial sources of food like berries, different sorts of berries and other fruits. And I think it's important to recognize that as an agricultural practice. And we have this term agroforestry that is gaining prominence across the United States, I think, as more and more land grant institutions and other universities are funding research into permaculture, different forms of sustainable agriculture. These New England forests were actually food forests and had been managed that way. And one of the big changes that took place over the 17th century into the 18th century under settler colonial intendants, I mean, these practices were stopped, and the forests of New England transitioned from kind of an oak savanna to a mixed fir and beech forest that's now dominated primarily by shade-tolerant species. So that's sort of the successive state for most of New England's forests, rather than the kind of more open parkland forests of the 17th century and before.
Now, like the Wampanoag and Haudenosaunee, which Michael also covers in his book, Native Foods, the Cherokee were also very skilled farmers. Michael, let's talk about Cherokee agriculture. Actually, first, let's take a moment to thank our episode sponsors and then talk about Cherokee agriculture. What would it take to reimagine the stories we tell about early America? At Ben Franklin's World, we explore the lives, ideas, and experiences that shaped the past and still shape us today. From indigenous foodways to the daily lives of ordinary people, from enslaved and free communities to voices long left out of our textbooks, we bring you the full human story of our early American past. This work exists because of listeners like you. As we approach Giving Tuesday on December 2nd, I would like to thank a few supporters who've made our recent episodes possible. Bonnie L., Michael L., Judy L., and Mark M. Your generosity keeps our history honest, inclusive, and free for everyone. Thank you so much for your support and for your generosity. Ben Franklin's World is produced by Clio Digital Media, a small nonprofit powered entirely by our community. So every gift, whether it's $5 or $100, helps us share more of the stories that reveal who we are and how we go from here. And because Clio Digital Media is a 501c3 nonprofit, your donation is fully tax deductible. So if you believe that history should reflect everyone's story, please visit benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And thank you. Thank you for supporting inclusive, curious, and courageous history today and on Giving Tuesday. Michael, Would you tell us about Cherokee agriculture and how it seems similar to and different from the Wampanoag agriculture of the 17th and 18th centuries that we've been discussing?
So Cherokee agriculture in many ways was similar to Wampanoag agriculture in terms of the kinds of crops and the combinations in which they were planted. I think one of the defining elements of Cherokee agriculture was the interplanting of corn, beans, and squash, which was a common practice throughout North America, but one that really dominated Cherokee bottomland farming in particular. So bottomlands are simply the alluvial flats along rivers, so lands prone to seasonal flooding. And on these bottomlands, basically the advantage is that there's an annual rejuvenation of organic matter to enrich the soil. What this also provides, too, is like this organic matter isn't compacted, so it becomes easier to plant seeds and it's easier for them to germinate. So anyway, the Three Sisters, this is sort of a common story, I think, that students of American history do get in their classes. But if you haven't gotten it, the Three Sisters refer to corn, beans, and squash. And it's this sort of symbiotic relationship they have in the garden, where the corn provides a trellis for the beans. The squash, vining out along the base, provides a kind of living mulch to shade out weeds. And the beans, as nitrogen-fixing legumes, will convert, as part of their photosynthesis process, nitrogen from the air into nitrogen that's available for the roots of the corn, which is a grass, which is a real high nitrogen intensive crop. So this is what I think horticulturalists now might refer to as like a green manuring or something like that. But this practice between the alluvial depositions and the nitrogen fixing process of the beans, this enabled Cherokee agriculture to persist in place for many more years. So one of the differences, whereas Wampanoags would periodically move their fields and allow a sort of natural fallowing process to replenish the soil, Cherokee farmers didn't have to do this as often because of their different strategy. And, this isn't a hard and fast difference. I'm sure actually Wampanoags were probably using similar strategies along New England river bottoms. But I think the scale of the Cherokee use of this sort of hydrological assistance was just in general larger.
We've now talked some about how the Cherokee are also very skilled at agriculture. But whites always seem to have this idea that the Cherokee were really hunters, not farmers. So, Michael, how did this particular myth develop? Why did white Europeans and Americans prefer to think of the Cherokee as hunters instead of the skilled agriculturalists that they were? And how did this vision of the Cherokee as hunters assist whites in removing them from their southeastern homelands?
Yeah, one of the ways that this settler colonial erase and replace process was justified was through this representation of Native people as predators, as these kind of beasts of the forest, killing other beasts of the forest, not practicing agriculture, not maintaining a forest as a food forest or something like that, but simply kind of wandering willy-nilly trying to hunt and gather. This was a very, very convenient narrative, particularly in the generation of the American Revolution before and after, in order to sort of create some kind of a stark fictional difference between Native society and this emerging American nation state, premised around agricultural development. And so I think a kind of persistent generational prerogative among settler colonialists in the early republic and before, you can trace a through line from George Washington to Andrew Jackson on this, is this sort of insistence on representing the Cherokee in particular as hunters and disavowing the centuries-long history of Cherokee agriculture and agricultural ingenuity, and really agricultural dependence. One of my favorite quotations is from a historian, Barbara Graymont, who referred to Sullivan's expedition during the Revolutionary War as a war on vegetables, where Sullivan and his troops basically systematically destroyed Iroquois farms all across what's now upstate New York. And the same thing happened with the Cherokee during the various Anglo-Cherokee Wars, during the American Revolutionary War. So I think by the time of this revolutionary generation, by the end of the Revolutionary War, a lot of Cherokees are kind of starving and hunting, trying to procure food in desperation, but not because they'd never had agricultural practices, but because they're agricultural capabilities had been systematically destroyed by American militias and, really through the sort of long string of wars across the second half of the 18th century. So there was this famous letter, George Washington wrote this letter to the Cherokees in the 1790s, basically exhorting them to take up the plow and stop hunting, civilize themselves through agriculture. And this is just such a disingenuous letter because, of course, George Washington himself, with his own background with Cherokees over as many years, he knew very well that the Cherokees were an agricultural people. They were farmers. They knew how to take up the plow. They had just been dispossessed, disenfranchised, and murdered over the course of the late 18th century. So transforming in this kind of discursive way Native people from farmers into hunters was a major strategy in terms of both trying to justify other representations of Native people as so-called savages or barbarians, but also to justify the dispossession of Native lands by insinuating that Native communities didn't use those lands productively, when in fact they did.
How did the myth that Native Americans never had any farms or practice any agriculture begin? And why does this myth seem to be so necessary to our image of the founding of the United States?
This is a question I don't think I've been able to answer to my satisfaction. But I think where I'm kind of going in terms of thinking this through is that this seizure of native agricultural spaces is what you might think of as like the primitive accumulation of settler colonialism. So that term, primitive accumulation, you might remember it from your econ courses or something. That refers to the initial moment in which capitalists seize the means of production, according to Karl Marx, and Marxian critiques of political economy that have suffused American social history and economic history. But thinking of that seizure very concretely as this kind of retitling of the North American continent, this is something that is performed, I think, in ways that historians haven't fully explored. And it's performed through historical narratives, where historical narratives become a type of recitation in the performance of land title. So if you own property or know someone who owns property and you take a look at the title, all the title is a sort of legal recitation, a legal narrative of who's owned the land and when it was exchanged. And there's nothing, of course, innate about private property ownership or something. It's not natural. It's a kind of social contract. It's something that has to be culturally adjudicated, something that has to be performed. And I think historians need to reckon with the fact that the histories that we tell about early America and the histories we tell about native agriculture and native food are part of that recitation of land title. They don't necessarily have to be that way, but I think there is something sort of substantial that's hidden in the way that historians narrate American history, where the kind of teleological end is to narrate the possession of North America by settler colonists. I think this is also one of the kind of unmentioned aspects of a land acknowledgement, for instance, too, that is actually quite beneficial. If you think about a land acknowledgement as something representative of indigenous protocol or something that they often mention, why are people critical of that and less critical of the sort of settler colonial protocol, which is conventional historical narratives that seek as their endpoint a sort of reestablishment of settler claims to the North American landscape? And so this is something that sounds very sort of offensive and distasteful. So instead of having to say it, we've just had this thing called the farm that kind of represents as a symbol of this sense of possession. So I don't know if this answers your question entirely, but when did this happen? I think it kind of happened from the moment that Pilgrims planted their corn crops on Wampanoag fields. It was this effort to put historical practice, which certainly looked different in the 17th century than it does now, but still an effort to put historical practice into the service of performing title to land.
It's now time for our segment 1776 in Context. As we're now in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, in your opinion, Michael, how do you think your research into Indigenous agriculture and foodways helps us better understand the American Revolution and its impact?
One of my favorite works of early American history is James McWilliams' book, A Revolution in Eating. what I like is kind of overall argument is not that the revolution changed how Americans were eating, but it changed how Americans talked about what they were eating. This is the kind of moment where Thomas Jefferson was spurned by Patrick Henry for abjuring his native victuals. So this is a moment I think that's interesting in the revolution. I mean, that phrase, the native victuals of North America, I think that's this really wonderful tacit acknowledgement that Patrick Henry's making about the sort of indigeneity of American cuisine. So, one of the things I'm exploring in this book, Native Foods, is really what happened to native foods? How come we don't have more native restaurants? It's not like we don't have any Native American restaurants, but it's not like all of these other cuisines that are widely represented. And I think the answer is simply because native cuisine has been co-opted as American cuisine, and that is this moment during the revolution when a lot of this takes place alongside these popular shifts among settler colonists to dissociate themselves from the British Empire, in part by embracing corn and other native foods and making them their own.
Now that you've written about native foods, Michael, where is your interest in agricultural history taking you now?
I've got a number of projects right now. One is the creation of an edible landscape on the University of North Texas campus that's informed by a large oral history project where I've got student assistants conducting interviews with folks in our region who are affiliated in some capacity with food and agriculture, from folks working in restaurant kitchens to farmers. It's a multilingual project that's trying to document experiences of immigrants, Native people, and other communities throughout northern Texas and southern Oklahoma and beyond. And then ultimately what we'd like to do is use the sort of interstitial places on campus to not only grow food for kind of public ownership and public consumption, but also offer some sort of historical interpretation that does more than just kind of identify so-called heirloom or heritage crops or something like that, but also speak to the broader historical narratives that those crops represent or might represent if they are interpreted that way. That's what I'm working on now, and I'll probably write some stuff related to it, but I'm not exactly sure what yet.
It sounds like a really great project, and I can imagine now walking through your campus, the North Texas campus, and maybe grabbing an ear of corn or an apple or a pear or some piece of produce that isn't typically grown in North Texas.
Yeah, so my students already just in this class, they planted about 800 chili transplants of different kinds that we're going to give away to the public.
That does sound great. Now, Michael, if we have more questions about native foods or your work, where's the best place for us to contact you?
Just send me an email, michael.wise@unt.edu.
Michael Wise, thank you for introducing us to native foods and the history and agriculture of the Wampanoag and Cherokee peoples.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Michael's insights remind us that Indigenous people were not just passive figures in early American history. They were scientists, farmers, and culinary innovators whose deep knowledge of the land shaped everything from what early Americans ate to how they lived. The histories we've inherited and learned in school describe Native peoples as hunters and gatherers who were dependent on the environment. But as new scholarship like Michael's reveals, Native communities like the Wampanoag and Cherokee had long-standing agricultural systems that were grounded in observation, a practice of agriculture, and cultural knowledge. What's fascinating is not just how this agricultural knowledge was just as sophisticated, if not more so, than European agricultural knowledge. It was also adapted to specific places and shaped by generations of trial, error, and innovation. This new, more accurate view of native food and agricultural practices forces us to rethink what we know about how settler colonialism worked, not just through land seizure and dispossession, but also through erasure. By denying Native peoples their role as farmers, agricultural experts, and stewards of the land, it made it easier for white colonists and settlers to justify their actions against Native peoples and claim sole possession of all the innovations that we've come to associate with American ingenuity. You can find more information about Michael, his book, Native Foods, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/426. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what food or food traditions do you associate with early American history? And how might our new insight into Indigenous agriculture change how you see them? This is something that I'm going to be thinking about for a while, and I'd love to trade ideas with you. So email me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com.